Former burden. Current guest. Those were the first words I read when I arrived at my son's company anniversary gala. I looked down at the badge in my hand, then read it again, certain my 71-year-old eyes had made a mistake. They hadn't. The ballroom around me shimmered with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and tables dressed in white linen. Waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks between groups of smiling executives. Everyone seemed to be celebrating. Everyone except me. My name was printed in elegant black lettering beneath the cruel phrase, as if someone had spent extra time making sure the insult looked professional. For a moment, I simply stood there. My fingers tightened around the badge. Then I slipped it onto my dress and walked inside. I had spent too many years teaching myself dignity to lose it in a hotel lobby. My son Ethan's company was celebrating its 20th anniversary. 200 guests had gathered to honor the remarkable success of the business he had built. Investors had flown in from New York and Chicago. Local officials were expected to attend. The event was being covered by business reporters. It should have been one of the proudest nights of my life. Instead, I felt like an unwanted visitor at my own family's celebration. "Margaret, there you are," a familiar voice called. I turned and saw my daughter-in-law Vanessa approaching. Her designer gown shimmered beneath the lights. She smiled brightly, but her eyes immediately dropped to my badge. Then she laughed. Not loudly enough to draw the attention of the entire room, just loudly enough for the people nearest to hear. "Oh good," she said. They remembered the special title. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One man looked away. Another forced a nervous smile. Vanessa seemed delighted by the reaction. "You know how Ethan is," she continued. "Always helping people, even family." The words landed softly, but their meaning was sharp. I felt heat rise into my face. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something colder. Something heavier. I looked at her for several seconds before offering a small smile. "You look lovely tonight, Vanessa," I said. Her expression flickered for the briefest moment. Perhaps she had expected an argument. Perhaps she had hoped I would create a scene. Instead, I walked toward the ballroom and left her standing there. My assigned seat was near the back of the room, far from Ethan's table and far from the stage. I sat quietly and watched guests arrive. Every few minutes someone glanced at my badge. Some frowned. Others pretended not to notice. Across the room, I spotted Ethan speaking with investors. He looked confident and successful. The sight filled me with both pride and sadness. Because as I sat there beneath the golden lights, listening to the music and the laughter, I could not shake the feeling that something about this evening had been carefully planned. And I had the strange sense that the small plastic badge pinned to my dress was only the beginning. I remained in my seat as the ballroom gradually filled, pretending to study the program booklet while quietly observing the people around me. The stage at the front of the room was framed by enormous screens displaying photographs from the company's 20-year journey. There was Ethan shaking hands with clients, Ethan accepting awards, Ethan standing beside community leaders. There were photographs of office openings, ribbon cuttings, and charity events. I watched image after image appear on the screens. Not once did I see a picture of the years that came before the success. Not once did I see the tiny apartment where Ethan and I shared canned soup because tuition bills came first. Not once did I see the second job I worked after his father died. The room celebrated the finished masterpiece, but nobody seemed interested in the foundation beneath it. A server stopped beside my table and offered sparkling water. I thanked him and took a glass. Across the ballroom, Vanessa moved effortlessly through the crowd. She greeted investors, laughed with executives, and accepted compliments as though she personally owned every success being celebrated that evening. People were drawn to her confidence. They always had been. For years I told myself that was a good thing. Ethan deserved a strong partner, someone ambitious, someone polished. Yet as I watched her smiling beneath the golden lights, old memories began surfacing. Small moments I had dismissed at the time. Family dinners where invitations somehow arrived late. Holiday gatherings that changed locations without anyone telling me. Birthdays where photographs appeared online and I discovered afterward that everyone had been together except me. Each incident had felt too small to question, too insignificant to confront. But sitting there alone at the back of the ballroom, I suddenly saw them differently. They were not isolated events. They were pieces of a larger pattern. The realization settled heavily in my chest. A few minutes later, a gentleman approached my table. He appeared to be in his early 60s, dressed in a dark suit with a company anniversary pin attached to his lapel. He hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked quietly. I looked up and nodded. "My name is Robert Hayes. I oversee financial operations." His expression carried an unusual seriousness. "I just wanted to say that I am sorry about the badge." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he lowered his voice. "Some of us were uncomfortable when we saw it." I managed a polite smile. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness." Robert glanced toward the front of the room where Vanessa was speaking with several board members. "Not everyone here agrees with everything that happens," he said carefully. There was something in his tone that caught my attention immediately. Not gossip, not sympathy, concern. Before I could respond, an announcement echoed through the ballroom, asking guests to prepare for the opening presentation. Robert straightened. "There is something I think you should know," he said. "But this is not the right moment." Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a business card. "Please keep this. We may need to talk later." With that, he walked away and disappeared into the crowd. I looked down at the card resting in my hand. Then I looked back toward Vanessa. She was laughing again, confident, relaxed, completely certain she controlled the room. Somehow, I had the feeling that before the night was over, that certainty might begin to crack. The lights dimmed as the opening presentation began. Conversations softened. Glasses settled onto tables. The enormous screens behind the stage came to life, filling the ballroom with images from 2 decades of company history. I watched quietly as photographs flashed across the room. Ethan at 23, standing inside a cramped office with folding tables. Ethan shaking hands with his first major client. Ethan celebrating expansion into a second location. The audience applauded at each milestone. They admired the story being told. But I noticed something strange. The early years felt incomplete. Certain details were missing. Certain chapters had simply vanished. It was as if someone had carefully edited the past to create a cleaner version of success. When the presentation ended, the master of ceremonies welcomed several senior executives to the stage. Applause filled the room again. Vanessa sat proudly near the front, smiling as though she belonged among the leadership team. Perhaps she believed she did. During a break between speeches, I glanced across the ballroom and noticed Robert Hayes standing near one of the side exits. He caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. A few moments later, I excused myself and walked toward the hallway outside the ballroom. The noise of the event faded behind me. Robert was waiting near a display of company awards. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. His expression looked even more serious than before. I did not want to discuss this in there. I folded my hands and waited. Robert seemed to choose his words carefully. "How much do you know about the company's earliest financing?" The question surprised me. "Not much," I admitted. "Ethan handled the business. I stayed out of the details." Robert nodded slowly. "That is what I suspected." For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "Many people inside the company believe the official story is incomplete." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He glanced down the hallway to make sure nobody was nearby. "There was a critical investment during the company's first year. Without it, the company would not have survived." I felt confused. I thought Ethan secured a small business loan. "That is what most people believe," Robert replied. "But there was another source of support, one that never received public recognition." My heartbeat quickened. Robert studied my face carefully. "Did Ethan ever mention receiving financial help from your late husband?" The question struck me like a sudden gust of cold air. Memories surfaced immediately. My husband Daniel spending long evenings reviewing paperwork at the kitchen table. Quiet conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. A home equity loan he once described as temporary. At the time, I trusted him completely and never asked questions. We were partners. We shared everything. Or so I thought. "No," I said softly. "He never told me much about it." Robert nodded as though my answer confirmed something. Then he reached into a folder he had been carrying and removed a photocopied document. "I think you should look at this later," he said. I accepted the paper with trembling fingers. Across the top was a date from nearly 20 years earlier. Beneath it was a familiar signature. My husband's. And for the first time that evening, I began to suspect that the story being celebrated inside that ballroom was not the whole truth. I slipped the document into my purse just as the ballroom doors opened again and guests began returning to their tables. Robert offered a small nod before heading in the opposite direction. Neither of us spoke another word. Back inside, The celebration continued as though nothing had changed, but everything felt different to me now. The music sounded distant. The laughter seemed rehearsed. I returned to my seat and carefully removed the photocopy from my purse beneath the table. The date at the top immediately caught my attention. It was from the year Ethan launched the company. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Most of the legal language meant little to me, but certain details stood out. There was a financial commitment listed. There was collateral. There was a signature. Daniel Collins. My husband. Ethan's father. I stared at the name for several seconds. Memories flooded back. 20 years earlier, our lives had looked very different. Ethan was ambitious but struggling. He had a dream and a tiny office. He had enthusiasm, but very little money. I remembered Daniel coming home late from meetings. I remembered the tension in his face whenever bills arrived. I remembered asking if everything was all right. He always smiled and told me not to worry. One particular evening returned to me with startling clarity. Daniel had sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight reviewing paperwork. A lamp cast a pool of yellow light across the room. I had walked in and asked if he needed help. He covered several pages with his hand and smiled. "Just helping Ethan get started," he said. At the time, I thought nothing of it. That was the kind of father he was. Quietly supportive, generous, proud of his son. Looking at the document now, I wondered how much help he had really provided. The master of ceremonies introduced another executive. Applause filled the room. My attention drifted toward the front tables where Ethan and Vanessa sat. Vanessa looked completely relaxed. She laughed at every joke. She accepted compliments from guests as if she belonged at the center of every conversation. Ethan seemed equally comfortable. Neither of them appeared aware that a forgotten piece of history had just resurfaced. Then something else caught my attention. One of the large screens displayed a timeline of major company milestones. According to the presentation, a critical investment had arrived during the company's first difficult year. The source was listed simply as private financing. No names, no explanation, no mention of Daniel. My pulse quickened. The omission suddenly felt intentional. I looked down at the document again, then back at the screen, then back at the document. Piece by piece, a new possibility began forming in my mind. Perhaps my husband had done far more than help Ethan get started. Perhaps he had helped save the company altogether. And if that was true, why had nobody ever spoken about it? Why had Ethan never mentioned it? Why had Vanessa gone out of her way to treat me like an unwanted burden tonight? As another round of applause echoed through the ballroom, I folded the paper carefully and returned it to my purse. For the first time since arriving, I no longer felt embarrassed by the badge pinned to my dress. I felt curious, because somewhere beneath the polished version of history being celebrated tonight, a much bigger story was waiting to be uncovered. The evening moved forward, but my attention remained fixed on questions nobody seemed willing to answer. One executive after another stepped onto the stage to praise the company's growth, revenue milestones, expansion plans, community awards. Every speech painted the same picture. Ethan had built everything through determination and talent alone. I believed he was talented. I believed he had worked hard. But now I also believed there were missing chapters hidden beneath the polished story being presented to hundreds of guests. During dinner service, I barely touched the grilled salmon placed in front of me. Instead, I watched the people around the room. The closer I looked, the more I noticed small details. Several long-term employees exchanged glances whenever the company's earliest years were mentioned. A few seemed uncomfortable. Others looked away entirely. It was subtle, easy to miss. Yet once I noticed it, I could not ignore it. Halfway through the meal, an older woman approached my table. She wore a company badge identifying her as a retired employee. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her smile carried a warmth I had not felt all evening. "Mrs. Collins?" she asked. I nodded. "I am Susan Parker. I worked with your husband years ago." The mention of Daniel immediately caught my attention. "It is nice to meet you," I said. Susan hesitated before sitting down. I was not sure if I should say anything. She glanced toward the front of the ballroom where Ethan and Vanessa were entertaining guests. "But after seeing how you were treated tonight, I think you deserve to know something." My pulse quickened. Susan folded her hands carefully. "Your husband believed in this company before anyone else did." I remained silent. Back then, banks were hesitant. Investors were uncertain. The business was struggling. Her voice softened. "Daniel never talked much about what he did. Because he wanted Ethan to earn his success. But many of us knew. I felt my throat tighten. Knew what? Susan smiled sadly. That he risked far more than most people realize. The words settled heavily between us. Memories surfaced again. Daniel postponing vacations. Delaying home repairs. Quietly adjusting household budgets. At the time, I thought we were simply being careful with money. Now I wondered whether every sacrifice had been connected to Ethan's dream. Susan reached into her purse and removed an old photograph. She handed it to me. My fingers trembled slightly as I studied it. There was Ethan standing inside his first office. Beside him stood several employees. And in the corner, smiling quietly, was Daniel. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date and a short message. Thank you for believing in us when nobody else would. I stared at the words for a long moment. Then I looked up at Susan. Does Ethan know? I asked. Susan's expression became complicated. I honestly do not know anymore. Before I could ask another question, applause erupted across the ballroom. The chairman was approaching the stage for the evening's final presentations. Susan squeezed my hand gently before standing. Keep asking questions, Margaret, she said softly. You may discover that the truth is much bigger than you think. Then she disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with the photograph, the memories, and a growing suspicion that my husband's role in this company's history had been deliberately forgotten. As the chairman began speaking, I placed the photograph and the document back inside my purse and focused on the stage. The evening was approaching its final act, yet I felt as though the Real story had only just begun. The chairman spoke about perseverance, innovation, and leadership. The audience responded warmly. Several times he praised the company's resilience during its earliest struggles. Each mention of those difficult years made me think of Daniel. I pictured him sitting at our kitchen table after midnight. I pictured him studying paperwork while the rest of us slept. I pictured the quiet sacrifices that had seemed ordinary at the time. The more I remembered, the less ordinary they appeared. When the speech ended, guests rose to stretch their legs before the final awards presentation. Conversations filled the ballroom once again. I remained seated, lost in thought, until a familiar voice interrupted me. Mrs. Collins. I looked up. Robert Hayes had returned. This time there was urgency in his expression. He pulled out a chair and sat beside me. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. Did your husband ever mention a trust? The question caught me off guard. A trust? He nodded. Any kind of family trust. Investment trust. Estate document. Anything. I searched my memory. For several seconds, nothing came to mind. Then suddenly, I remembered a conversation from years ago. It had happened shortly before Daniel passed away. We had been organizing paperwork in his home office. He handed me a folder and told me to keep it somewhere safe. At the time, I assumed it contained routine estate documents. After his funeral, I placed the folder in a filing cabinet and never thought about it again. There may have been something, I said slowly. Robert leaned forward. Do you still have it? I think so. His expression tightened. If it is the document I believe it is, then you need to find it. My heart began beating faster. Why? Robert hesitated. Because some of us believe the original investment agreement may still exist through that trust. I stared at him. You mean Daniel's investment? He nodded carefully. The one nobody talks about anymore. A silence settled between us. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood near the stage laughing with several board members. She looked completely confident, completely secure. Watching her, I suddenly understood something important. She believed the past had been erased. She believed nobody would ever question the official version of events. Robert followed my gaze. There are people here who remember what happened, he said softly. But many have stayed quiet for years. Why? I asked. He gave a weary smile. Because success has a way of rewriting history. Those words stayed with me. Success has a way of rewriting history. I looked around the ballroom. The expensive decorations. The polished speeches. The carefully constructed narrative. Everything celebrated tonight had been built upon a foundation that suddenly seemed much more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. Then an announcement echoed through the room. Guests were asked to return to their seats for the evening's final recognition ceremony. Robert stood. Before leaving, he slipped a folded note onto the table beside my plate. Read this later, he said. And whatever you do, do not throw away any of Daniel's old files. Then he disappeared into the crowd. I unfolded the note after he left. Written in neat handwriting was a single sentence. The original founder story is not the one they are telling tonight. I read the words twice, then a third time, and as the lights dimmed for the next presentation, I realized I was no longer attending a celebration. I was sitting in the middle of a mystery that someone had spent 20 years trying to keep buried. The ballroom fell quiet as the chairman stepped back onto the stage for the final recognition ceremony. Soft music faded into silence. Spotlights swept across the audience before settling on the front tables where the company's senior leadership sat. Ethan adjusted his tie and exchanged a confident smile with Vanessa. They looked comfortable beneath the attention. Certain. Secure. I sat motionless at the back of the room with Robert's note folded inside my purse. The sentence continued echoing in my mind. The original founder story is not the one they are telling tonight. One by one, awards were presented. Executives walked across the stage to accept plaques and applause. The audience responded warmly. Then came the final award of the evening. The chairman described it as a tribute to individuals whose contributions had shaped the company's future. A large screen displayed photographs from the early years. I watched carefully. Once again, important pieces seemed missing. Familiar faces appeared. Historic moments were highlighted. Yet Daniel was nowhere to be seen. It felt less like an oversight and more like a decision. As the chairman continued speaking, I noticed several longtime employees exchanging uneasy glances. They were not reacting to the award itself. They were reacting to what had been left out. The omission had become impossible to ignore. Then Vanessa rose from her seat and approached the podium. The audience applauded enthusiastically. She accepted the microphone with practiced confidence. "Tonight is about vision," she said. "It is about the courage to build something extraordinary from nothing." More applause followed. She spoke elegantly about leadership, determination, and sacrifice. Listening to her, one might have believed she had personally witnessed every chapter of the company's history. Several guests nodded in admiration. Others smiled approvingly. Yet with every sentence, I felt the gap between the official story and the truth growing wider. Near the end of her speech, Vanessa glanced toward the back of the ballroom. Her eyes briefly found me. A small smile touched her lips. "Success also requires learning when to move forward," she said. "Sometimes people hold on to the past instead of embracing progress." A few guests laughed politely. The remark sounded harmless, but I knew exactly who it was meant for. She was speaking to me, or perhaps about me. Either way, she wanted the room to understand that some people belong to the future and others belong to history. She returned to her seat beneath another round of applause. I expected the evening to continue exactly as planned. Instead, something unexpected happened. The chairman remained standing at the podium. He glanced toward the audience, then toward the leadership table. Finally, he looked directly at the back of the ballroom. "Before we conclude tonight's celebration," he said, "there is one person I would like to acknowledge." The room grew quiet again. I felt my stomach tighten. The chairman smiled gently. "A person whose connection to this company goes back further than many realize." For a moment, nobody moved. Then he spoke my name. Hundreds of heads turned at once. Conversation stopped. Even Vanessa looked confused. Ethan stared toward the back of the room as though trying to understand what was happening. I remained seated for several seconds, stunned by what I had just heard. The chairman extended his hand toward the stage. "Mrs. Margaret Collins," he said warmly, "would you please join us?" I could feel hundreds of eyes following me as I stood and slowly walked toward the stage. The ballroom seemed unusually quiet. Even the soft background music had faded away. Each step felt strangely calm. Earlier that evening, I had arrived feeling embarrassed by a badge designed to humiliate me. Now, as I approached the podium, I felt something entirely different. Clarity. The chairman greeted me warmly and handed me the microphone. "Many people here know the company's public history," he said, "but there are parts of its early story that deserve to be remembered." He stepped aside. I looked across the room. Ethan was staring at me with visible confusion. Vanessa sat perfectly still. For the first time all evening, her confident smile had disappeared. I took a slow breath. "Thank you," I said. "I did not expect to speak tonight." A few guests smiled politely. 20 years ago, this company was not celebrating success in a ballroom. It was struggling to survive in a tiny office. The room remained silent. Back then, my husband Daniel believed in a young man with a dream. That young man was our son. I glanced toward Ethan. His expression softened slightly. Daniel never cared about recognition. He believed that helping family was simply what you did. I opened my purse and carefully removed the old photograph Susan had given me. Then I held it up. The large screens behind me immediately displayed the image for the audience. A murmur moved through the room. Employees leaned forward in their seats. Several longtime staff members exchanged knowing looks. This photograph was taken during the company's first year. I continued. Many people in this room never knew it existed. I paused briefly. Neither did I. A few surprised smiles appeared. Then I removed the photocopied document Robert had shown me earlier. Tonight, I learned something about my husband that he never told me. My voice remained steady. While the company was facing serious financial challenges, Daniel quietly provided support that helped keep it alive. The audience became completely still. I could hear glasses being set down on tables. Nobody seemed interested in their dinner anymore. He never spoke about it because he wanted Ethan to earn every success through hard work. I looked directly at my son, and he did. Ethan lowered his eyes. I could see emotion beginning to replace confusion. This is not a story about ownership, I said. It is not a story about credit. I folded the document carefully. It is a story about remembering the people who stood beside us before success arrived. Several employees began applauding. The sound spread slowly through the ballroom. Then more people joined. Across the room, I noticed Robert. Beside him stood Susan. Both were smiling. The chairman stepped forward once again. "There is one more thing our guests should know," he said. He turned toward the audience. The Collins Family Trust, established by Daniel Collins, remains one of the earliest recorded private supporters of this company. Our board recently confirmed the documentation. A wave of surprise moved through the room. Heads turned toward Ethan, then toward me, finally toward Vanessa. Her face had gone completely pale. The room was no longer focused on titles, speeches, or carefully polished narratives. For the first time that evening, people were looking directly at the truth. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the applause grew louder. It rolled through the ballroom like a wave. Employees stood first, then executives, then investors. One by one, people rose to their feet. I looked across the room and saw faces that had spent the entire evening avoiding my eyes. Now many of them were smiling. Others appeared thoughtful. A few looked embarrassed. The standing ovation was not really for me. It was for the truth. It was for a man who had quietly helped build something important without ever asking for recognition. I glanced toward Ethan. His eyes were fixed on the photograph displayed on the giant screen behind me. The image of his father seemed to have reached him in a way no speech ever could. Slowly, he stood from his chair and walked toward the stage. The ballroom remained silent as he approached. When he reached me, he did something that surprised everyone. He wrapped his arms around me. "I did not know," he whispered. His voice trembled slightly. "Mom, I honestly did not know." I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. For years I had blamed Ethan for many things. Some of that blame had been deserved. Some had not. Looking at him now, I saw not a successful executive. I saw the young man his father had believed in all those years ago. Ethan stepped back and looked out at the audience. "My father should have been part of this story from the beginning," he said. "And so should my mother." The applause returned immediately. This time it felt different. Warmer. More sincere. Across the room, Vanessa remained seated. The confidence she had worn all evening was gone. She stared at the table in front of her. Nobody was paying attention to her anymore. Nobody was laughing at her jokes. Nobody seemed interested in the image she had worked so hard to create. The room had shifted, not because anyone attacked her, not because anyone embarrassed her. The truth had simply become impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, the ceremony officially ended. Guests began gathering their coats and exchanging final conversations. Several longtime employees approached me personally. They shared stories about Daniel, small acts of generosity I had never known about, encouragement he had given during difficult times, risks he had taken when the company's future looked uncertain. With every story, I felt closer to him again, as though a part of him had quietly been waiting all these years to be rediscovered. Eventually, I walked toward the exit. The badge was still pinned to my dress. I removed it and looked at it one last time. Earlier that evening, it had been intended as a reminder that I did not belong. Now it seemed strangely meaningless. I folded it once and dropped it into a nearby trash bin. Outside, the night air felt cool and refreshing. Ethan followed me into the parking lot. Mom, he called softly. I turned around. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. I spent years chasing success. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to protect the people who helped me reach it. I smiled gently. Then remember now. He nodded. No grand promises. No dramatic speeches. Just understanding. Sometimes that is enough. As I drove home beneath the city lights, I thought about Daniel. About truth. About dignity. Success may rewrite history for a while, but eventually, the truth finds its way back into the light. And when it does, it speaks louder than any insult ever could.